Chapter 1 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonja. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 1. Monkshaven. On the northeastern shores of England there is a town called Monkshaven, containing at the present day about 15,000 inhabitants. There were, however, but half the number at the end of the last century, and it was at that period that the events narrated in the following pages occurred. Monkshaven was a name not unknown in the history of England, and traditions of its having been the landing place of a throneless queen were current in the town. At that time there had been a fortified castle on the heights above it, the site of which was now occupied by a deserted manor house. And at an even earlier date than the arrival of the queen and coeval with the most ancient remains of the castle, a great monastery had stood on those cliffs, overlooking the vast ocean that blended with the distant sky. Monkshaven itself was built by the side of the Dee, just where the river falls into the German Ocean. The principal street of the town ran parallel to the stream, and smaller lanes branched out of this and straggled up the sides of the steep hill, between which and the river the houses were penned in. There was a bridge across the Dee, and consequently a bridge street running at right angles to the High Street, and on the south side of the stream there were a few houses of more pretension, around which lay gardens and fields. It was on this side of the town that the local aristocracy lived, and who were the great people of this small town? Not the younger branches of the county families that held hereditary state in their manor houses on the wide bleak moors, that shut in Monkshaven almost as effectually on the land side as ever the waters did on the seaboard. No, these old families kept aloof from the unsavory yet adventurous trade which brought wealth to generation after generation of certain families in Monkshaven. The magnates of Monkshaven were those who had the largest number of ships engaged in the whaling trade. Something like the following was the course of life with a Monkshaven lad of this class. He was apprenticed as a sailor to one of the great ship owners, to his own father possibly, along with 20 other boys, or, it might be, even more. During the summer months he and his fellow apprentices made voyages to the Greenland seas, returning with their cargoes in the early autumn, and employing the winter months in watching the preparation of the oil from the blubber in the malting sheds, and learning navigation from some quaint but experienced teacher, half schoolmaster, half sailor, who seasoned his instructions by stirring narrations of the wild adventures of his youth. The house of the ship owner to whom he was apprenticed was his home, and that of his companions, during the idle season between October and March. The domestic position of these boys varied according to the premium paid. Some took rank with the sons of the family, others were considered as little better than servants. Yet once on board an equality prevailed, in which, if any claimed superiority, it was the bravest and brightest. After a certain number of voyages, the Monkshaven lad would rise by degrees to be captain, and as such would have a share in the venture. All these profits, as well as all his savings, would go towards building a whaling vessel of his own, if he was not so fortunate as to be the child of a ship owner. At the time of which I write, there was but little division of labour in the Monkshaven whale fishery. The same man might be the owner of 6 or 7 ships, any of which he himself was fitted by education and experience to command. The master of a score of apprentices, each of whom paid a pretty sufficient premium, and the proprietor of the malting sheds into which his cargoes of blubber and whalebone were conveyed to be fitted for sale. It was no wonder that large fortunes were acquired by these ship owners, nor that their houses on the south side of the river Dee were stately mansions, full of handsome and substantial furniture. It was also not surprising that the whole town had an amphibious appearance, to a degree unusual even in a seaport. Every one depended on the whale fishery, and almost every male inhabitant had been, or hoped to be, a sailor. Down by the river the smell was almost intolerable to any but Monkshaven people during certain seasons of the year, but on these unsavoury days the old men and children lounged for hours, almost as if they revelled in the odours of train oil. This is perhaps enough of a description of the town itself. I have said that the country for miles all around was moorland. High above the level of the sea towered the purple crags, whose summits were crowned with greensward that stole down the sides of the scaur a little way in grassy banes. Here and there a brook forced its way from the heights down to the sea, making its channel into a valley more or less broad in long process of time. And in the moorland hollows, as in these valleys, trees and underwood grew and flourished, so that, while on the bare swells of the high land you shivered at the waste desolation of the scenery, when you dropped into these wooded bottoms, you were charmed with the nestling shelter which they gave. But above and around these rare and fertile vales there were moors for many a mile, here and there bleak enough, with the red freestone cropping out above the scanty herbage. Then, perhaps, there was a brown tract of peat and bog, uncertain footing for the pedestrian who tried to make a short cut to his destination. Then, on the higher sandy soil, there was the purple ling, or commonest species of heather, growing in beautiful wild luxuriance. Tufts of fine elastic grass were occasionally to be found, on which the little black-faced sheep browsed, but either the scanty food or their goat-like agility kept them in a lean condition that did not promise much for the butcher, nor yet was their wool of a quality fine enough to make them profitable in that way to their owners. In such districts there is little population at the present day. There was much less in the last century, before agriculture was sufficiently scientific to have a chance of contending with such natural disqualifications as the moors presented, and when there were no facilities of railroads to bring sportsmen from a distance to enjoy the shooting season and make an annual demand for accommodation. There were old stone halls in the valleys. There were bare farmhouses to be seen on the moors at long distances apart, with small stacks of coarse poor hay and almost larger stacks of turf for winter fuel in their farmyards. The cattle in the pasture fields belonging to these farms looked half starved, but somehow there was an odd, intelligent expression in their faces, as well as in those of the black-visaged sheep, which is seldom seen in the placidly stupid countenances of well-fed animals. All the fences were turf banks, with loose stones piled into walls at the top of these. There was comparative fertility and luxuriance down below in the rare green dales. The narrow meadows stretching along the brookside seemed as though the cows could really satisfy their hunger in the deep rich grass, whereas, on the higher lands, the scanty herbage was hardly worth the fatigue of moving about in search of it. Even in these bottoms, the piping sea winds, following the current of the stream, stunted and cut low any trees, but still there was rich thick underwood, tangled and tied together with brambles and briar-rose and honeysuckle, and if the farmer in these comparatively happy valleys had had wife or daughter who cared for gardening, many a flower would have grown on the western or southern side of the rough stone house. But at that time gardening was not a popular art in any part of England. In the north it is not yet. Noblemen and gentlemen may have beautiful gardens, but farmers and day labourers care little for them north of the Trent, which is all I can answer for. A few berry bushes, a black currant tree or two, the leaves to be used in heightening the flavour of tea, the fruit as medicinal for colds and sore throats, a potato ground, and this was not so common at the close of the last century as it is now, a cabbage bed, a bush of sage and balm and thyme and marjoram, with possibly a rose tree and old men growing in the midst, a little plot of small strong coarse onions, and perhaps some marigolds, the petals of which flavoured the salt beef broth. Such plants made up a well-furnished garden to a farmhouse at the time and place to which my story belongs. But for 20 miles inland there was no forgetting the sea, nor the sea trade. Refuse shellfish, seaweed, the offal of the malting houses, were the staple manure of the district. Great ghastly whale jaws, bleached bare and white, were the arches over the gate-posts to many a field or moorland stretch. Out of every family of several sons, however agricultural their position might be, one had gone to sea, and the mother looked wistfully seaward at the changes of the keen piping moorland winds. The holiday rambles were to the coast. No one cared to go inland to see aught, unless indeed it might be to the great annual horse fairs held where the dreary lane broke into habitation and cultivation. Somehow in this country sea thoughts followed the thinker far inland, whereas in most other parts of the island, at 5 miles from the ocean, he has all but forgotten the existence of such an element as salt water. The great Greenland trade of the coasting towns was the main and primary cause of this, no doubt, but there was also a dread and an irritation in everyone's mind at the time of which I write, in connection with the neighboring sea. Since the termination of the American War, there had been nothing to call for any unusual energy in manning the navy, and the grants required by government for this purpose diminished with every year of peace. In 1792 this grant touched its minimum for many years. In 1793 the proceedings of the French had set Europe on fire, and the English were raging with anti-Gallican excitement, fomented into action by every expedient of the Crown and its ministers. We had our ships, but where were our men? The Admiralty had, however, a ready remedy at hand, with ample precedent for its use, and with common, if not statute, law to sanction its application. They issued press warrants, calling upon the civil power throughout the country to support their officers in the discharge of their duty. The sea-coast was divided into districts, under the charge of a captain in the navy, who again delegated sub-districts to lieutenants, and in this manner all homeward-bound vessels were watched and waited for, all ports were under supervision, and in a day, if need were, a large number of men could be added to the forces of His Majesty's navy. But if the Admiralty became urgent in their demands, they were also willing to be unscrupulous. Landsmen, if able-bodied, might soon be trained into good sailors, and once in the hold of the tender, which always awaited the success of the operations of the press-gang, it was difficult for such prisoners to bring evidence of the nature of their former occupations, especially when none had leisure to listen to such evidence, or were willing to believe it if they did listen, or would act upon it for the release of the captive, if they had by possibility both listened and believed. Men were kidnapped, literally disappeared, and nothing was ever heard of them again. The street of a busy town was not safe from such press-gang captures, as Lord Thurlow could have told, after a certain walk he took about this time in Tower Hill, when he, the Attorney-General of England, was impressed, when the Admiralty had its own peculiar ways of getting rid of tiresome besiegers and petitioners. Nor yet were lonely inland dwellers more secure. Many a rustic went to a statute fair or mob, and never came home to tell of his hiring. Many a stout young farmer banished from his place by the hearse of his father, and was no more heard of by mother or lover. So great was the press for men to serve in the navy during the early years of the war with France, and after every great naval victory of that war. The servants of the Admiralty lay in wait for all merchantmen and traders. There were many instances of vessels returning home after long absence, and laden with rich cargo, being boarded within a day's distance of land, and so many men pressed and carried off, that the ship with her cargo became unmanageable from the loss of her crew, drifted out again into the wide ocean, and was sometimes found in the helpless guidance of 1 or 2 infirm or ignorant sailors. Sometimes such vessels were never heard of more. The men thus pressed were taken from the near grasp of parents or wives, and were often deprived of the hard earnings of years, which remained in the hands of the masters of the merchantmen in which they had served, subject to all the chances of honesty or dishonesty, life or death. Now all this tyranny, for I can use no other word, is marvellous to us. We cannot imagine how it is that a nation submitted to it for so long, even under any warlike enthusiasm, any panic of invasion, any amount of loyal subservience to the governing powers. When we read of the military being called in to assist the civil power in backing up the press-gang, of parties of soldiers patrolling the streets, and sentries with screwed bayonets played at every door while the press-gang entered and searched each hole and corner of the dwelling, when we hear of churches being surrounded during divine service by troops, while the press-gang stood ready at the door to seize men as they came out from attending public worship, and take these instances as merely types of what was constantly going on in different forms, we do not wonder at Lord Mayors and other civic authorities in large towns complaining that a stop was put to business by the danger which the tradesmen and their servants incurred in leaving their houses and going into the streets, infested by press gangs. Whether it was that living in closer neighborhood to the metropolis, the center of politics and news, inspired the inhabitants of the southern counties with a strong feeling of that kind of patriotism which consists in hating all other nations, or whether it was that the chances of capture were so much greater at all the southern ports that the merchant sailors became inured to the danger, or whether it was that serving in the navy, to those familiar with such towns as Portsmouth and Plymouth, had an attraction to most men from the dash and brilliancy of the adventurous employment, it is certain that the southerners took the oppression of press warrants more submissively than the wild northeastern people. For with them the chances of profit beyond their wages in the whaling or Greenland trade extended to the lowest description of sailor. He might rise by daring and saving to be a ship-owner himself. Numbers around him had done so, and this very fact made the distinction between class and class less apparent, and the common ventures and dangers, the universal interest felt in one pursuit, bound the inhabitants of that line of coast together with a strong tie, the severance of which by any violent extraneous measure gave rise to passionate anger and thirst for vengeance. A Yorkshireman once said to me, "My county folk are all alike. Their first thought is how to resist. Why, I myself, if I hear a man say it is a fine day, catch myself trying to find out that it is no such thing. It is so in thought, it is so in word, it is so in deed." So you may imagine the press gang had no easy time of it on the Yorkshire coast. In other places they inspired fear, but here rage and hatred. The Lord Mayor of York was warned on 20th January 1777 by an anonymous letter that if those men were not sent from the city on or before the following Tuesday, his lordship's own dwelling and the mansion house also should be burned to the ground. Perhaps something of the ill feeling that prevailed on the subject was owing to the fact which I have noticed in other places similarly situated, where the landed possessions of gentlemen of ancient family but limited income surround a centre of any kind of profitable trade or manufacture. There is a sort of latent ill-will on the part of the squires to the tradesman, be he manufacturer, merchant, or ship-owner, in whose hands is held a power of money-making which no hereditary pride or gentlemanly love of doing nothing prevents him from using. This ill-will, to be sure, is mostly of a negative kind. Its most common form of manifestations is an absence of speech or action, a sort of torpid and genteel ignoring all unpleasant neighbours. But really, the whale fisheries of Monkshaven had become so impertinently and obtrusively prosperous of late years at the time of which I write, the Monkshaven ship-owners were growing so wealthy and consequential, that the squires, who lived at home and ease in the old stone manor-houses scattered up and down the surrounding moorland, felt that the check upon the Monkshaven trade likely to be inflicted by the press-gang was wisely ordained by the higher powers. How high they placed these powers I will not venture to say. To prevent overhaste in getting rich, which was a scriptural fault, they also thought that they were only doing their duty, and backing up the Admiralty warrants for all the civil power at their disposal, whenever they were called upon, and whenever they could do so without taking too much trouble in affairs which did not, after all, much concern themselves. There was just another motive in the minds of some provident parents of many daughters. The captains and lieutenants employed on the service were most agreeable bachelors, brought up to a genteel profession. At the least they were very pleasant visitors when they had a day to spare. Who knew what might come of it? Indeed, these brave officers were not unpopular in Monkshaven itself, except at the time when they were brought into actual collision with the people. They had the frank manners of their profession, they were known to have served in those engagements, the very narrative of which at this day will warm the heart of a Quaker, and they themselves did not come prominently forward in the dirty work which, nevertheless, was permitted and quietly sanctioned by them. So while few Monkshaven people passed the low public-house over which the navy blue flag streamed, as a sign that it was the rendezvous of the press-gang, without spitting towards it in sign of abhorrence, yet perhaps the very same persons would give some rough token of respect to Lieutenant Atkinson if they met him in High Street. Touching their heads was an unknown gesture in those parts, but they would move their heads in a droll, familiar kind of way, neither a wag nor a nod, but meant all the same to imply friendly regard. The ship owners, too, invited him to an occasional dinner or supper, all the time looking forward to the chances of his turning out an active enemy, and not by any means inclined to give him the run of the house, however many unmarried daughters might grace their table. Still, as he could tell a rattling story, drink hard, and was seldom too busy to come at a short notice, he got on better than any one could have expected with the Monkshaven folk, and the principal share of the odium of his business fell on his subordinates, who were one and all regarded in the light of mean kidnappers and spies, vermin, as the common people esteemed them, and as such they were ready at the first provocation to hunt and to worry them, and little cared the press gang for this. Whatever else they were brave and daring. They had law to back them, therefore their business was lawful. They were serving the king and country, they were using all their faculties, and that is always pleasant. There was plenty of scope for the glory and triumph of outwitting, plenty of adventure in their life. It was a lawful and loyal employment, requiring sense, readiness, courage, and besides it called out that strange love of the chase inherent in every man. 14 or 15 miles at sea lay the Aurora, good man of war, and to her were conveyed the living cargoes of several tenders, which were stationed at likely places along the sea-coast. One, the Lively Lady, might be seen from the cliffs above Monkshaven, not so far away, but hidden by the angle of the high lands from the constant sight of the townspeople, and there was always the Rendezvous House, as the public house with the navy blue flag was called thereabouts, for the crew of the Lively Lady to lounge about, and there to offer drink to unwary passers-by. At present this was all that the press gang had done at Monkshaven. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 2. Home from Greenland. One hot day, early in October of the year 1796, 2 girls set off from their country homes to Monkshaven to sell their butter and eggs, for they were both farmers' daughters, though rather in different circumstances, for Molly Corney was one of a large family of children, and had to rough it accordingly. Sylvia Robson was an only child, and was much made of in more people's estimation than Mary's by her elderly parents. They had each purchases to make after their sales were effected, as sales of butter and eggs were effected in those days, by the market women sitting on the steps of the great old mutilated cross till a certain hour in the afternoon, after which, if all their goods were not disposed of, they took them unwillingly to the shops and sold them at lower price. But good housewives did not despise coming themselves to the butter cross, and smelling and depreciating the articles they wanted, kept up a perpetual struggle of words, trying, often in vain, to beat down prices. A housekeeper of the last century would have thought that she did not know her business, if she had not gone through this preliminary process, and the farmers' wives and daughters treated it all as a matter of course, replying with a good deal of independent humour to the customer who, once having discovered where good butter and fresh eggs were to be sold, came time after time to depreciate the articles she always ended in taking. There was leisure for all this kind of work in those days. Molly had tied a knot in her pink-spotted handkerchief for each of the various purchases she had to make, dull but important articles needed for the week's consumption at home. If she forgot any one of them, she knew she was sure of a good rating from her mother. The number of them made her pocket-handkerchief look like one of the 9 tails of a cat, but not a single thing was for herself, nor indeed for any one individual of her numerous family. There was neither much thought nor much money to spend for any but collective wants in the Corney family. It was different with Sylvia. She was going to choose her first cloak, not to have an old one of her mother's, that had gone down through 2 sisters, died for the 4th time, and Molly would have been glad had even this chance been hers, but to buy a brand new duffel cloak all for herself, with not even an elder authority to curb her as to price, only Molly to give her admiring counsel, and as much sympathy as was consistent with a little patient envy of Sylvia's happier circumstances. Every now and then they wandered off from the one grand subject of thought, but Sylvia, with unconscious art, soon brought the conversation round to the fresh consideration of the respective merits of grey and scarlet. These girls were walking barefoot, and carrying their shoes and stockings in their hands, during the first part of their way, but as they were drawing near Monkshaven they stopped, and turned aside along a footpath that led from the main road down to the banks of the Dee. There were great stones in the river about here, round which the waters gathered and eddied and formed deep pools. Molly sate down on the grassy bank to wash her feet, but Sylvia, more active, or perhaps lighter hearted with the notion of the cloak in the distance, placed her basket on a gravelly bit of shore, and giving a long spring, seated herself on a stone almost in the middle of the stream. Then she began dipping her little rosy toes in the cool rushing water, and whisking them out with childish glee. 'Be quiet, will thee, Sylvia? Thou's splashing all ower, and my feyther's none to be so keen on giving me a new cloak as thine is, seemingly.' Sylvia was quiet, not to say penitent, in a moment. She drew up her feet instantly, and as if to take herself out of temptation, she turned away from Molly to that side of her stony seat on which the current ran shallow and broken by pebbles. But once disturbed in her play, her thoughts reverted to the great subject of the cloak. She was now as still as a minute before she had been full of frolic and gambolling life. She had tucked herself up on the stone, as if it had been a cushion, and she a little sultana. Molly was deliberately washing her feet and drawing on her stockings, when she heard a sudden sigh, and her companion turned round so as to face her, and said, 'I wish mother hadn't spoken up for t' grey.' 'Why, Sylvia, thou wert saying as we'd top to brow, as she did not but bid thee think twice afore settling on scarlet.' 'Ay, but mother's words are scarce and weigh heavy. Feyther's liker me, and we talk a deal o' rubble, but mother's words are liker to hewn stone. She puts a deal o' meaning in 'em. And then,' said Sylvia, as if she was put out by the suggestion, 'she bid me ask cousin Philip for his opinion. I hate a man as has getten an opinion on such like things.' 'Well, we shall never get to Monkshaven this day, either for to sell our eggs and stuff, or to buy thy cloak, if we're sitting here much longer. T' sun's for to slanting low. So come along, lass, and let's be going.' 'But if I put on my stockings and shoon here, and jump back in yon wet gravel, I'se not be fit to be seen,' said Sylvia, in a pathetic tone of bewilderment that was funnily childlike. She stood up, her bare feet curved round the curving surface of the stone, her slight figure balancing, as if in act to spring. 'Thou knows thou'll have to just jump back barefoot, and wash thy feet afresh, without making all that ado. Thou shouldst ha' done it at first, like me, and all other sensible folk. But thou'st getten no gumption.' Molly's mouth was stopped by Sylvia's hand. She was already on the river bank by her friend's side. 'Now, dunnot lecture me. I'm none for a sermon hung on every peg o' words. I'm going to have a new cloak, lass, and I cannot heed thee if thou dost lecture. Thou shalt have all the gumption, and I'll have my cloak.' It may be doubted whether Molly thought this an equal division. Each girl wore tightly fitted stockings, knit by her own hands, of the blue worsted common in that country. They had on neat high-heeled black leather shoes, coming well over the instep, and fastened as well as ornamented with bright steel buckles. They did not walk so lightly and freely now as they did before they were shod, but their steps were still springy with the buoyancy of early youth, for neither of them was 20. Indeed, I believe Sylvia was not more than 17 at this time. They clambered up the steep grassy path, with brambles catching at their kilted petticoats, through the copsewood, till they regained the high road, and then they settled themselves, as they called it, that is to say, they took off their black felt hats, and tied up their clustering hair afresh. They shook off every speck of wayside dust, straightening the little shawls, or large neckerchiefs, call them what you will, that were spread over their shoulders, pinned below the throat, and confined at the waist by their apron strings. And then putting on their hats again, and picking up their baskets, they prepared to walk decorously into the town of Monkshaven. The next turn of the road showed them the red peaked roofs of the closely packed houses lying almost directly below the hill on which they were. The full autumn sun brought out the ruddy colour of the tiled gables, and deepened the shadows in the narrow streets. The narrow harbour at the mouth of the river was crowded with small vessels of all descriptions, making an intricate forest of masts. Beyond lay the sea, like a flat pavement of sapphire, scarcely a ripple varying its sunny surface, that stretched out leagues away, till it blended with the softened azure of the sky. On this blue, trackless water floated scores of white-sailed fishing boats, apparently motionless, unless you measured their progress by some landmark, but still and silent and distant as they seemed. The consciousness that there were men on board, each going forth into the great deep, added unspeakably to the interest felt in watching them. Close to the bar of the River Dee, a larger vessel lay to. Sylvia, who had only recently come into the neighbourhood, looked at this with the same quiet interest as she did all the others. But Molly, as soon as her eye caught the build of it, cried out aloud, "She's a whaler! She's a whaler home from the Greenland seas! The first this season! God bless her!" And she turned round and shook both Sylvia's hands in the fullness of her excitement. Sylvia's colour rose, and her eyes sparkled out of sympathy. "Is 'ta sure?" she asked, breathless in her turn, for though she did not know by the aspect of the different ships on what trade they were bound, yet she was well aware of the paramount interest attached to whaling vessels. 3 o'clock, and it's not high water till 5, said Molly. If we're sharp, we can sell our eggs and be down to the Staithes before she comes into port. Be sharp, lass!" And down the long steep hill they went at a pace that was almost a run. A run they dared not make it, and as it was, the rate at which they walked would have caused destruction among eggs less carefully packed. When the descent was ended, there was yet the long narrow street before them, bending and swerving from the straight line, as it followed the course of the river. The girls felt as if they should never come to the market place, which was situated at the crossing of Bridge Street and High Street. There the old stone cross was raised by the monks long ago. Now worn and mutilated, no one esteemed it as a holy symbol, but only as the butter cross, where market women clustered on Wednesday, and whence the town crier made all his proclamations of household sales, things lost or found, beginning with "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes," and ending with "God bless the King and the Lord of this manor," and a very brisk "Amen," before he went on his way, and took off the livery coat, the colours of which marked him as a servant of the Burnabys, the family who held manorial rights over Monkshaven. Of course the much frequented space surrounding the Buttercross was the favourite centre for shops, and on this day, a fine market day, just when good housewives begin to look over their winter store of blankets and flannels and discover their needs betimes, these shops ought to have had plenty of customers, but they were empty and of even quieter aspect than their everyday wont. The three-legged creepy stools that were hired out at a penny an hour to such market women as came too late to find room on the steps, were unoccupied, knocked over here and there, as if people had passed by in haste. Molly took in all at a glance, and interpreted the signs, though she had no time to explain their meaning, and her consequent course of action, to Sylvia, but darted into a corner shop. "T' whalers is coming home! There's one lying outside t' bar!" This was put in the form of an assertion, but the tone was that of eager cross-questioning. "Ay," said a lame man, mending fishing nets behind a rough deal counter. "She's come back early, and she's brought good news o' t' others as I've heerd say. Time was I should ha' been on the stage throwing up my cap wi' the best of 'em, but now it pleases the Lord to keep me at home, and set me to mind other folks' gear. See thee, wench, there's a vast o' folk ha' left their skeps o' things wi' me while they're away down t' quay side. Leave me your eggs, and be off wi' ye for t' see t' fun, for maybe you'll live to be palsied yet, and then you'll be fretting o'er spilt milk, and that you didn't take all your chances when you was young. Ay, well, they're out o' hearing o' my moralities. I better find a lammeter like mysen to preach to, for it's not everybody has t' luck t' clergy has of saying ter say out whether folks likes it or not." He put the baskets carefully away with much of such talk as this addressed to himself while he did so. Then he sighed once or twice, and then he took the better course and began to sing over his tarry work. Molly and Sylvia were far along the Staithes by the time he got to this point of cheerfulness. They ran on, regardless of stitches and pains in the side, on along the river bank to where the concourse of people was gathered. There was no great length of way between the Buttercross and the harbour. In 5 minutes the breathless girls were close together in the best place they could get for seeing, on the outside of the crowd, and in as short a time longer they were pressed inwards by fresh arrivals into the very midst of the throng. All eyes were directed to the ship, beating her anchor just outside the bar, not a quarter of a mile away. The custom house officer was just gone aboard of her to receive the captain's report of his cargo and make due examination. The men who had taken him out on his boat were rowing back to the shore, and brought small fragments of news when they had landed a little distance from the crowd, which moved as one man to hear what was to be told. Sylvia took a hard grasp of the hand of the older and more experienced Molly, and listened open-mouthed to the answers she was extracting from a gruff old sailor she happened to find near her. What ship is she?' 'T' Resolution of Monkshaven,' said he indignantly, as if any goose might have known that. 'An' a good resolution, and a blessed ship she's been to me,' piped out an old woman close at Mary's elbow. 'She's brought me home my ae lad, for he shouted to yon boatman to bid him tell me he was well. "Tell Peggy Christensen," says he, "my name is Margaret Christensen, tell Peggy Christensen as her son Hezekiah is come back safe and sound, the Lord's name be praised, and me a widow as never thought to see my lad again." It seemed as if everybody relied on every one else's sympathy in that hour of great joy. "I ax pardon, but if you'd give me just a bit o' elbow room for a minute like, I'd hold my babby up, so that he might see daddy's ship, and happen my master might see him. He's 4 month old last Tuesday se'nnight, and his feyther's never clapped e'en on him yet, and he wi' a tooth through, and another just breaking, bless him." One or two of the better end of the Monkshaven inhabitants stood a little before Molly and Sylvia, and as they moved in compliance with the young mother's request, they overheard some of the information these ship owners had received from the boatman. "Haynes says they'll send the manifest of the cargo ashore in 20 minutes, as soon as Fishburn has looked over the casks. Only 8 whales, according to what he says." "No one can tell," said the other, "till the manifest comes to hand. I'm afraid he's right, but he brings a good report of the Good Fortune. She's off St Abb's Head, with something like 15 whales to her share. We shall see how much is true when she comes in. That'll be by the afternoon tide to morrow." "That's my cousin's ship," said Molly to Sylvia. "He's specksioneer on board the Good Fortune." An old man touched her as she spoke. "I humbly make my manners, missus, but I'm stone blind. My lad's aboard yon vessel outside t' bar, and my old woman is bedfast. Will she be long, think ye, in making to harbour? Because if so be as she were, I just make my way back, and speak a word or two to my missus, who'll be boiling o'er into some make o' mischief, now she knows he's so near. May I be so bold as to ax if t' crooked negro is covered yet?" Molly stood on tiptoe to try and see the black stone thus named, but Sylvia, stooping and peeping through the glimpses afforded between the arms of the moving people, saw it first, and told the blind old man it was still above water. "A watched pot," he says, "never boils, I reckon. It's ta'en a vast o' watter to cover that stone to day. Anyhow, I'll have time to go home and rate my missus for worreting hersen, as I'll be bound she's done, for all as a bade her not, but to keep easy and content." "We'd better be off too," said Molly, as an opening was made through the press to let out the groping old man. "Eggs and butter is yet to sell, and that cloak's to be bought." "Well, I suppose we had," said Sylvia, rather regretfully, for though all the way into Monkshaven her head had been full of the purchase of this cloak, yet she was of that impressible nature that takes the tone of feeling from those surrounding, and though she knew no one on board the Resolution, she was just as anxious for the moment to see her come into harbour as any one in the crowd who had a dear relation on board, so she turned reluctantly to follow the more prudent Molly along the quay back to the Buttercross. It was a pretty scene, though it was too familiar to the eyes of all who then saw it for them to notice its beauty. The sun was low enough in the west to turn the mist that filled the distant valley of the river into golden haze. Above, on either bank of the Dee, there lay the moorland heights, swelling one behind the other, the nearer russet brown with the tints of the fading bracken, the more distant grey and dim against the rich autumnal sky. The red and fluted tiles of the gabled houses rose in crowded irregularity on one side of the river, while the newer suburb was built in more orderly and less picturesque fashion on the opposite cliff. The river itself was swelled and chafing with the incoming tide, till its vexed waters rushed over the very feet of the watching crowd on the staithes, as the great sea waves encroached more and more every minute. The quay side was unsavourily ornamented with glittering fish scales, for the hauls of fish were cleansed in the open air, and no sanitary arrangements existed for sweeping away any of the relics of this operation. The fresh salt breeze was bringing up the lashing, leaping tide from the blue sea beyond the bar. Behind the returning girls there rocked the white-sailed ship, as if she were all alive with eagerness for her anchors to be heaved. How impatient her crew of beating hearts were for that moment, how those on land sickened at the suspense, may be imagined, when you remember that for 6 long summer months those sailors had been as if dead from all news of those they loved, shut up in terrible dreary Arctic seas, from the hungry sight of sweethearts and friends, wives and mothers. No one knew what might have happened. The crowd on shore grew silent and solemn before the dread of the possible news of death that might toll in upon their hearts with this uprushing tide. The whalers went out into the Greenland seas full of strong, hopeful men, but the whalers never returned as they sailed forth. On land there are deaths among 200 or 300 men to be mourned over in every half-year's space of time, whose bones had been left to blacken on the grey and terrible icebergs, who lay still until the sea should give up its dead. Who were those who should come back to Monkshaven never, no, never more? Many a heart swelled with passionate, unspoken fear as the first whaler lay off the bar on her return voyage. Molly and Sylvia had left the crowd in this hushed suspense. But 50 yards along the stave they passed 5 or 6 girls with flushed faces and careless attire, who had mounted a pile of timber, placed there to season for shipbuilding, from which, as from the steps of a ladder or staircase, they could command the harbour. They were wild and free in their gestures, and held each other by the hand, and swayed from side to side, stamping their feet in time as they sang, "Weel may the keel row, the keel row, the keel row, well may the keel row that my laddie's in." "What for are ye going off now?" they called out to our 2 girls. "She'll be in 10 minutes." And without waiting for the answer which never came, they resumed their song. Old sailors stood about in little groups, too proud to show their interest in the adventures they could no longer share, but quite unable to keep up any semblance of talk on indifferent subjects. The town seemed very quiet and deserted as Molly and Sylvia entered the dark, irregular Bridge Street, and the market place was as empty of people as before. But the skeps and baskets and 3-legged stools were all cleared away. "Market's over for to day," said Molly Corney, in disappointed surprise. "We mun make the best on it, and sell to the hucksters, and a hard bargain they'll be for driving. I doubt mother'll be vexed." She and Sylvia went to the corner shop to reclaim their baskets. The man had his joke at them for their delay. "Ay, ay, lasses as has sweethearts a coming home don't care much what price they get for butter and eggs. I dare say now, there's some un in yon ship that'd give as much as £1 a pound for this butter, if only he knowed who churned it." This was to Sylvia, as he handed back her property. The fancy-free Sylvia reddened, pouted, tossed back her head, and hardly deigned a farewell word of thanks or civility to the lame man. She was at an age to be affronted by any jokes on such a subject. Molly took the joke without disclaimer and without offence. She rather liked the unfounded idea of her having a sweetheart, and was rather surprised to think how devoid of foundation the notion was. If she could have a new cloak, as Sylvia was going to have, then, indeed, there might be a chance. Until some such good luck, it was as well to laugh and blush as if the surmise of her having a lover was not very far from the truth, and so she replied in something of the same strain as the lame net maker to his joke about the butter. "He'll need it all, and more too, to grease his tongue, if ever he reckons to win me for his wife." When they were out of the shop, Sylvia said in a coaxing tone, "Molly, who is it? Whose tongue'll need greasing? Just tell me, and I'll never tell." She was so much in earnest that Molly was perplexed. She did not quite like saying that she had alluded to no one in particular, only to a possible sweetheart, so she began to think what young man had made the most civil speeches to her in her life. The list was not a long one to go over, for her father was not so well off as to make her sought after for her money, and her face was rather of the homeliest. But she suddenly remembered her cousin, the specksioneer, who had given her 2 large shells, and taken a kiss from her half-willing lips before he went to sea the last time. So she smiled a little, and then said, "Well, I dunno, it's ill talking of these things afore one has made up one's mind. And perhaps if Charlie Kinraid behaves hissen, I might be brought to listen." "Charlie Kinraid, who's he?" "Yon specksioneer cousin of mine as I was talking on." "And do you think he cares for you?" asked Sylvia, in a low, tender tone, as if touching on a great mystery. Molly only said, "Be quiet wi' you," and Sylvia could not make out whether she cut the conversation so short because she was offended, or because they had come to the shop where they had to sell their butter and eggs. "Now, Sylvia, if thou'll leave me thy basket, I'll make as good a bargain as iver I can on 'em, and thou can be off to choose this grand new cloak as is to be afore it gets any darker. Where is ta going to?" "Mother said I'd better go to Foster's," answered Sylvia, with a shade of annoyance in her face. "Feyther said just anywhere." "Foster's is t' best place. Thou canst try anywhere afterwards. I'll be at Foster's in 5 minutes, for I reckon we mun hasten a bit now. It'll be near 5 o'clock." Sylvia hung her head and looked very demure as she walked off by herself to Foster's shop in the market place. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 3. Buying a New Cloak. Foster's shop was the shop of Monkshaven. It was kept by two Quaker brothers, who were now old men, and their father had kept it before them, probably his father before that. People remembered it as an old-fashioned dwelling-house, with a sort of supplementary shop with unglazed windows projecting from the lower story. These openings had long been filled with panes of glass that at the present day would be accounted very small, but which 70 years ago were much admired for their size. I can best make you understand the appearance of the place by bidding you think of the long openings in a butcher's shop, and then to fill them up in your imagination with panes about 8 inches by 6, in a heavy wooden frame. There was one of these windows on each side of the door-place, which was kept partially closed through the day by a low gate about a yard high. Half the shop was appropriated to grocery, the other half to drapery and a little mercery. The good old brothers gave all their known customers a kindly welcome, shaking hands with many of them, and asking after all their families and domestic circumstances before proceeding to business. They would not for the world have had any sign of festivity at Christmas, and scrupulously kept their shop open at that holy festival, ready themselves to serve, sooner than tax the consciences of any of their assistants, only nobody ever came. But on New Year's Day they had a great cake and wine ready in the parlour behind the shop, of which all who came in to buy anything were asked to partake. Yet, though scrupulous in most things, it did not go against the consciences of these good brothers to purchase smuggled articles. There was a back way from the riverside up a covered entry to the yard door of the Fosters, and a peculiar kind of knock at this door always brought out either John or Jeremiah, or if not them, their shopman Philip Hepburn. And the same cake and wine that the excise officer's wife might just have been tasting was brought out in the back parlour to treat the smuggler. There was a little locking of doors and drawing of the green silk curtain that was supposed to shut out the shop, but really all this was done much for form's sake. Everybody in Monkshaven smuggled who could, and every one wore smuggled goods who could, and great reliance was placed on the excise officer's neighbourly feelings. The story went that John and Jeremiah Foster were so rich that they could buy up all the new town across the bridge. They had certainly begun to have a kind of primitive bank in connection with their shop, receiving and taking care of such money as people did not wish to retain in their houses for fear of burglars. No one asked them for interest on the money thus deposited, nor did they give any. But on the other hand, if any of their customers, on whose character they could depend, wanted a little advance, the Fosters, after due inquiries made, and in some cases due security given, were not unwilling to lend a moderate sum without charging a penny for the use of their money. All the articles they sold were as good as they knew how to choose, and for them they expected and obtained ready money. It was said that they only kept on the shop for their amusement. Others averred that there was some plan of a marriage running in the brothers' heads, a marriage between William Coulson, Mr. Jeremiah's wife's nephew (Mr. Jeremiah was a widower), and Hester Rose, whose mother was some kind of distant relation, and who served in the shop along with William Coulson and Philip Hepburn. Again, this was denied by those who averred that Coulson was no blood relation, and that if the Fosters had intended to do anything considerable for Hester, they would never have allowed her and her mother to live in such a sparing way, eking out their small income by having Coulson and Hepburn for lodgers. No, John and Jeremiah would leave all their money to some hospital or to some charitable institution. But of course there was a reply to this. When are there not many sides to an argument about a possibility concerning which no facts are known? Part of the reply turned on this. The old gentlemen had probably some deep plan in their heads in permitting their cousin to take Coulson and Hepburn as lodgers, the one a kind of nephew, the other, though so young, the head man in the shop. If either of them took a fancy to Hester, how agreeably matters could be arranged. All this time Hester is patiently waiting to serve Sylvia, who is standing before her, a little shy, a little perplexed and distracted, by the sight of so many pretty things. Hester was a tall young woman, sparely yet largely formed, of a grave aspect, which made her look older than she really was. Her thick brown hair was smoothly taken off her broad forehead, and put in a very orderly fashion under her linen cap. Her face was a little square, and her complexion sallow, though the texture of her skin was fine. Her grey eyes were very pleasant, because they looked at you so honestly and kindly. Her mouth was slightly compressed, as most have it who are in the habit of restraining their feelings. But when she spoke you did not perceive this, and her rare smile slowly breaking forth showed her white even teeth, and when accompanied, as it generally was, by a sudden uplifting of her soft eyes, it made her countenance very winning. She was dressed in stuff of sober colours, both in accordance with her own taste, and in unasked compliance with the religious customs of the Fosters. But Hester herself was not a friend. Sylvia, standing opposite, not looking at Hester, but gazing at the ribbons in the shop window, as if hardly conscious that any one awaited the expression of her wishes, was a great contrast. Ready to smile or to pout, or to show her feelings in any way, with a character as undeveloped as a child's, affectionate, wilful, naughty, tiresome, charming, anything, in fact, at present that the chances of an hour called out. Hester thought her customer the prettiest creature ever seen, in the moment she had for admiration, before Sylvia turned round and, recalled to herself, began, "Oh, I beg your pardon, miss. I was thinking what may the price of yon crimson ribbon be?" Hester said nothing, but went to examine the shop mark. "Oh, I did not mean that I wanted any. I only want some stuff for a cloak. Thank you, miss, but I am very sorry. Some duffel, please." Hester silently replaced the ribbon, and went in search of the duffel. While she was gone, Sylvia was addressed by the very person she most wished to avoid, and whose absence she had rejoiced over on first entering the shop, her cousin Philip Hepburn. He was a serious-looking young man, tall, but with a slight stoop in his shoulders brought on by his occupation. He had thick hair standing off from his forehead in a peculiar but not unpleasing manner, a long face with a slightly aquiline nose, dark eyes, and a long upper lip, which gave a disagreeable aspect to a face that might otherwise have been good-looking. "Good day, Sylvie," he said. "What are you wanting? How are all at home? Let me help you." Sylvia pursed up her red lips and did not look at him as she replied, "I'm very well, and so is mother. Feyther's got a touch of rheumatiz, and there's a young woman getting what I want." She turned a little away from him when she had ended this sentence, as if it had comprised all she could possibly have to say to him. But he exclaimed, "You won't know how to choose," and seating himself on the counter, he swung himself over after the fashion of shopmen. Sylvia took no notice of him, but pretended to be counting over her money. "What do you want, Sylvie?" asked he, at last annoyed at her silence. "I don't like to be called Sylvie. My name is Sylvia, and I'm wanting duffel for a cloak, if you must know." Hester now returned, with a shop boy helping her to drag along the great rolls of scarlet and gray cloth. "Not that," said Philip, kicking the red duffel with his foot, and speaking to the lad. "It's the gray you want, is it not, Sylvie?" He used the name he had had the cousin's right to call her by since childhood, without remembering her words on the subject not 5 minutes before, but she did, and was vexed. "Please, miss, it is the scarlet duffel I want. Don't let him take it away." Hester looked up at both their countenances, a little wondering what was their position with regard to each other. For this, then, was the beautiful little cousin about whom Philip had talked to her mother, as sadly spoilt and shamefully ignorant, a lovely little dunce, and so forth. Hester had pictured Sylvia Robson somehow as very different from what she was, younger, more stupid, not half so bright and charming; for, though she was now both pouting and cross, it was evident that this was not her accustomed mood. Sylvia devoted her attention to the red cloth, pushing aside the gray. Philip Hepburn was vexed at his advice being slighted, and yet he urged it afresh. "This is a respectable, quiet-looking article that will go well with any colour. You never will be so foolish as to take what will mark with every drop of rain." "I'm sorry you sell such good-for-nothing things," replied Sylvia, conscious of her advantage, and relaxing a little as she possibly could, of her gravity. Hester came in now. "He means to say that this cloth will lose its first brightness in wet or damp, but it will always be a good article, and the colour will stand a deal of wear. Mr. Foster would not have it in his shop else." Philip did not like that even a reasonable peace-making interpreter should come between him and Sylvia, so he held his tongue in indignant silence. Hester went on, "To be sure, this gray is the closer make, and would wear the longest." "I don't care," said Sylvia, still rejecting the dull gray. "I like this best. 8 yards, if you please, miss." "A cloak takes 9 yards at least," said Philip, decisively. "Mother told me 8," said Sylvia, secretly conscious that her mother would have preferred the more sober colour, and feeling that as she had had her own way in that respect, she was bound to keep to the directions she had received as to the quantity. But, indeed, she would not have yielded to Philip in anything that she could help. There was a sound of children's feet running up the street from the river side, shouting with excitement. At the noise, Sylvia forgot her cloak and her little spirit of vexation, and ran to the half door of the shop. Philip followed because she went. Hester looked on with passive, kindly interest, as soon as she had completed her duty of measuring. One of those girls whom Sylvia had seen as she and Molly left the crowd on the quay, came quickly up the street. Her face, which was handsome enough as to feature, was whitened with excess of passionate emotion, her dress untidy and flying, her movements heavy and free. She belonged to the lowest class of seaport inhabitants. As she came near, Sylvia saw that the tears were streaming down her cheeks, quite unconsciously to herself. She recognized Sylvia's face, full of interest as it was, and stopped her clumsy run to speak to the pretty, sympathetic creature. 'She's ower t' bar! She's ower t' bar! I'm bound to tell mother!' She caught at Sylvia's hand and shook it, and went on breathless and gasping. 'Sylvia, how came you to know that girl?' asked Philip sternly. 'She's not one for you to be shaking hands with. She's known all down to quayside as Newcastle Bess.' 'I can't help it,' said Sylvia, half inclined to cry at his manner even more than his words. 'When folk are glad, I can't help being glad too. And I just put out my hand, and she put out hers. To think o' yon ship come in at last, and if you'd been down seeing all t' folk looking and looking their eyes out, as if they feared they should die afore she came in and brought home the lads they loved, you'd ha' shaken hands with that lass too, and no great harm done. I never set eyne upon her till half an hour ago on t' Staithes, and maybe I'll never see her again.' Hester was still behind the counter, but had moved so as to be near the window, so she heard what they were saying, and now put in her word. 'She can't be altogether bad, for she thought o' telling her mother first thing, according to what she said.' Sylvia gave Hester a quick, grateful look, but Hester had resumed her gaze out of the window, and did not see the glance. And now Molly Corney joined them, hastily bursting into the shop. 'Hech!' she said. 'Hearken! How they're crying and shouting down on t' quay! T' gang's among 'em like t' day of judgment! Hark!' No one spoke, no one breathed. I had almost said no heart beat for listening. Not long. In an instant there rose the sharp simultaneous cry of many people in rage and despair. Inarticulate at that distance, it was yet an intelligible curse, and the roll and the roar and the irregular tramp came nearer and nearer. 'They're taking him to Randyvowse,' said Molly. 'I wish I'd King George here just to tell him my mind.' The girl clenched her hands and set her teeth. 'It's terrible hard,' said Hester. 'There's mothers and wives looking out for 'em, as if they were stars dropped out o' lift.' 'But can we do nothing for 'em?' cried Sylvia. 'Let us go into the thick of it, and do a bit of help. I can't stand quiet and see it.' Half crying, she pushed forwards to the door, but Philip held her back. 'Sylvie, you must not. Don't be silly. It's the law, and no one can do aught against it, least of all women and lasses.' By this time the vanguard of the crowd came pressing up Bridge Street, past the windows of Foster's shop. It consisted of wild, half-amphibious boys, slowly moving backwards as they were compelled by the pressure of the coming multitude to go on, and yet anxious to defy and annoy the gang by insults and curses half choked with their indignant passion, doubling their fists in the very faces of the gang, who came on with measured movement, armed to the teeth, their faces showing white with repressed and determined energy against the bronzed countenances of the half-dozen sailors, who were all they had thought it wise to pick out of the whaler's crew, this being the first time an Admiralty warrant had been used in Monkshaven for many years, not since the close of the American War, in fact. One of the men was addressing to his townspeople, in a high-pitched voice, an exhortation which few could hear, for pressing around this nucleus of cruel wrong were women crying aloud, throwing up their arms in imprecation, showering down abuse as hearty and rapid as if they had been a Greek chorus. Their wild, famished eyes were strained on faces they might not kiss, their cheeks were flushed to purple with anger, or else livid with impotent craving for revenge. Some of them looked scarce human, and yet an hour ago these lips, now tightly drawn back so as to show the teeth with the unconscious action of an enraged wild animal, had been soft and gracious with the smile of hope. Eyes that were fiery and bloodshot now had been loving and bright. Hearts never to recover from the sense of injustice and cruelty had been trustful and glad only one short hour ago. There were men there, too, sullen and silent, brooding on remedial revenge, but not many, the greater proportion of this class being away in the absent whalers. The stormy multitude swelled into the market-place and formed a solid crowd there, while the press-gang steadily forced their way on to High Street, and on to the rendezvous. A low, deep growl went up from the dense mass, as some had to wait for space to follow the others, now and then going up, as a lion's growl goes up, into a shriek of rage. A woman forced her way from the bridge. She lived some little way in the country, and had been late in hearing of the return of the whaler after her 6 months' absence, and on rushing down to the quayside she had been told by a score of busy, sympathizing voices that her husband was kidnapped for the service of the government. She had need pause in the market-place, the outlet of which was crammed up. Then she gave tongue, for the first time, in such a fearful shriek, you could hardly catch the words she said. "Jamie! Jamie! Will they not let you to me?" These were the last words Sylvia heard before her own hysterical burst of tears called every one's attention to her. She had been very busy about household work in the morning, and much agitated by all she had seen and heard since coming to Monkshaven, and so it ended in this. Molly and Hester took her through the shop into the parlour beyond, John Foster's parlour, for Jeremiah, the elder brother, lived in a house of his own on the other side of the water. It was a low, comfortable room, with great beams running across the ceiling, and papered with the same paper as the walls, a piece of elegant luxury which took Molly's fancy mightily. This parlour looked out on the dark courtyard, in which there grew 2 or 3 poplars, straining upwards to the light, and through an open door between the backs of 2 houses could be seen a glimpse of the dancing, heaving river, with such ships or fishing cobles as happened to be moored in the waters above the bridge. They placed Sylvia on the broad old-fashioned sofa, and gave her water to drink, and tried to still her sobbing and choking. They loosed her hat, and copiously splashed her face and clustering chestnut hair, till at length she came to herself, restored, but dripping wet. She sate up, and looked at them, smoothing back her tangled curls off her brow, as if to clear both her eyes and her intellect. "Where am I? Oh, I know, thank you. It was very silly, but somehow it seemed so sad." And here she was nearly going off again, but Hester said, "Ay, it were sad, my poor lass, if I may call you so, for I don't rightly know your name, but it's best not to think on it, for we can do no make o' good, and it'll maybe set you off again. You're Philip Hepburn's cousin, I reckon, and you bide at Haytersbank Farm?" "Yes, she's Sylvia Robson," put in Molly, not seeing that Hester's purpose was to make Sylvia speak, and so to divert her attention from the subject which had set her off into hysterics. "And we came in for market," continued Molly, "and for to buy t' new cloak as her feyther's going to give her; and for sure, I thought we was in luck's way when we saw t' first whaler, and never dreaming as t' press gang 'd be so marred." She, too, began to cry, but her little whimper was stopped by the sound of the opening door behind her. It was Philip, asking Hester by a silent gesture if he might come in. Sylvia turned her face round from the light, and shut her eyes. Her cousin came close up to her on tiptoe, and looked anxiously at what he could see of her averted face. Then he passed his hand so slightly over her hair that he could scarcely be said to touch it, and murmured, "Poor lassie! It's a pity she came to day, for it's a long walk in this heat." But Sylvia started to her feet, almost pushing him along. Her quickened senses heard an approaching step through the courtyard before any of the others were aware of the sound. In a minute afterwards the glass door at one corner of the parlour was opened from the outside, and Mr. John stood looking in with some surprise at the group collected in his usually empty parlour. "It's my cousin," said Philip, reddening a little. "She came wi' her friend to market, and to make purchases, and she's got a turn wi' seeing the press gang go past carrying some of the crew of the whaler to the Randyvowse." "Ay, ay," said Mr. John, quickly passing into the shop on tiptoe, as if he were afraid he were intruding in his own premises, and beckoning Philip to follow him there. "Out of strife cometh strife. I guessed something of the sort was up from what I heard on t' bridge as I came across for brother Jeremiah's." Here he softly shut the door between the parlour and the shop. "It beareth hard on t' expectant women and childer, nor is it to be wondered at that they, being unconverted, rage together, poor creatures, like the very heathen. Philip," he said, coming nearer to his head young man, "keep Nicholas and Henry at work in the ware room upstairs till this riot be over, for it would grieve me if they were misled into violence." Philip hesitated. "Speak out, man. Always ease an uneasy heart, and never let it get hidebound." "I had thought to convoy my cousin and the other young woman home, for the town is like to be rough, and it's getting dark." "And thou shalt, my lad," said the good old man, "and I myself would try and restrain the natural inclinations of Nicholas and Henry." But when he went in to find the shop boys with a gentle homily on his lips, those to whom it should have been addressed were absent. In consequence of the riotous state of things, all the other shops in the market place had put their shutters up, and Nicholas and Henry, in the absence of their superiors, had followed the example of their neighbours, and, as business was over, they had hardly waited to put the goods away, but had hurried off to help their townsmen in any struggle that might ensue. There was no remedy for it, but Mr. John looked rather discomfited. The state of the counters, and of the disarranged goods, was such also as would have irritated any man as orderly but less sweet-tempered. All he said on the subject was, "The old Adam, the old Adam," but he shook his head long after he had finished speaking. "Where is William Coulson?" he next asked. "Oh, I remember. He was not to come back from York until the night closed in." Philip and his master arranged the shop in the exact order the old man loved. Then he recollected the wishes of his subordinate, and turned round and said, "Now, go with thy cousin and her friend. Hester is here, and old Hannah. I myself will take Hester home if need be, but, for the present, I think she had best tarry here, as it isn't many steps to her mother's house, and we may need her help if any of those poor creatures fall into suffering with their violence." With this, Mr. John knocked at the door of the parlour, and waited for permission to enter. With old-fashioned courtesy, he told the two strangers how glad he was that his room had been of service to them, that he would never have made so bold as to pass through if he had been aware how it was occupied; and then going to a corner cupboard, high up in the wall, he pulled a key out of his pocket, and unlocked his little store of wine and cake and spirits, and insisted that they should eat and drink while waiting for Philip, who was taking some last measures for the security of the shop during the night. Sylvia declined everything, with less courtesy than she ought to have shown to the offers of the hospitable old man. Molly took wine and cake, leaving a good half of both, according to the code of manners in that part of the country, and also because Sylvia was continually urging her to make haste; for the latter disliked the idea of her cousin's esteeming it necessary to accompany them home, and wanted to escape from him by setting off before he returned. But any such plans were frustrated by Philip's coming back into the parlour, full of grave content, which brimmed over from his eyes, with the parcel of Sylvia's obnoxious red duffle under his arm, anticipating so keenly the pleasure awaiting him in the walk, that he was almost surprised by the gravity of his companions as they prepared for it. Sylvia was a little penitent for her rejection of Mr. John's hospitality, now she found out how unavailing for its purpose such rejection had been, and tried to make up by a modest sweetness of farewell, which quite won his heart, and made him praise her up to Hester in a way to which she, observant of all, could not bring herself to fully respond. What business had the pretty little creature to reject kindly meant hospitality in the pettish way she did, thought Hester. And oh, what business had she to be so ungrateful, and to try and thwart Philip in his thoughtful wish of escorting them through the streets of the rough riotous town? What did it all mean? End of chapter 3.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 4. Philip Hepburn. The coast on that part of the island to which this story refers is bordered by rocks and cliffs. The inland country immediately adjacent to the coast is level, flat, and bleak. It is only where the long stretch of dike-enclosed fields terminates abruptly in a sheer descent, and the stranger sees the ocean creeping up the sands far below him, that he is aware on how great an elevation he has been. Here and there, as I have said, a cleft in the level land, thus running out into the sea in steep promontories, occurs, what they would call a chine in the Isle of Wight. But instead of the soft south wind stealing up the woody ravine as it does there, the eastern breeze comes piping shrill and clear along these northern chasms, keeping the trees that venture to grow on the sides down to the mere height of scrubby brushwood. The descent to the shore through these bottoms is in most cases very abrupt, too much so for a cartway or even a bridle path, but people can pass up and down without difficulty, by the help of a few rude steps hewn here and there out of the rock. 60 or 70 years ago, not to speak of much later times, the farmers who owned or hired the land which lay directly on the summit of these cliffs were smugglers to the extent of their power. only partially checked by the coastguard, distributed, at pretty nearly equal interspaces of 8 miles, all along the north-eastern seaboard. Still, sea wrack was a good manure, and there was no law against carrying it up in great osier baskets for the purpose of tillage, and many a secret thing was lodged in hidden crevices in the rocks till the farmer sent trusty people down to the shore for a good supply of sand and seaweed for his land. One of the farms on the cliff had lately been taken by Sylvia's father. He was a man who had roamed about a good deal, been sailor, smuggler, horse-dealer, and farmer in turns, a sort of fellow possessed by a spirit of adventure and love of change, which did him and his own family more harm than anybody else. He was just the kind of man that all his neighbours found fault with, and all his neighbours liked. Late in life, for such an impudent man as he was one of a class who generally wed, trusting to chance and luck for the provision for a family. Farmer Robson married a woman whose only want of practical wisdom consisted in taking him for a husband. She was Philip Hepburn's aunt, and had had the charge of him until she married from her widowed brother's house. He it was who had let her know when Haytersbank Farm had been to let, esteeming it a likely piece of land for his uncle to settle down upon, after a somewhat unprosperous career of horse-dealing. The farmhouse lay in the shelter of a very slight green hollow, scarcely scooped out of the pasture field by which it was surrounded. The short, crisp turf came creeping up to the very door and windows, without any attempt at a yard or garden, or any nearer enclosure of the buildings than the stone dyke that formed the boundary of the field itself. The buildings were long and low, in order to avoid the rough violence of the wind that swept over that wild, bleak spot, both in winter and summer. It was well for the inhabitants of that house that coal was extremely cheap, otherwise a southerner might have imagined that they could never have survived the cutting of the bitter gales that piped all round, and seemed to seek out every crevice for admission into the house. But the interior was warm enough when once you had mounted the long bleak lane, full of round rough stones, enough to lame any horse unaccustomed to such roads, and had crossed the field by the little dry, hard footpath, which tacked about so as to keep from directly facing the prevailing wind. Mrs. Robson was a Cumberland woman, and as such was a cleaner housewife than the farmers' wives of that north-eastern coast, and was often shocked at their ways, showing it more by her looks than by her words, for she was not a great talker. This fastidiousness in such matters made her own house extremely comfortable, but did not tend to render her popular among her neighbours. Indeed, Bell Robson piqued herself on her housekeeping generally, and once indoors in the grey bare stone house, there were plenty of comforts to be had besides cleanliness and warmth. The great rack of clapbread hung overhead, and Bell Robson's preference of this kind of oatcake over the leavened and partly sour kind used in Yorkshire was another source of her unpopularity. Flitches of bacon and hams, that is, shoulders of cured pork, the legs or hams being sold as fetching a better price, abounded, and for any visitor who could stay, neither cream nor finest wheaten flour was wanting for turf cakes and singing hinnies, with which it is the delight of the northern housewives to regale the honoured guest as he sips their high-priced tea, sweetened with dainty sugar. This night Farmer Robson was fidgeting in and out of his house door, climbing the little eminence in the field, and coming down disappointed in a state of fretful impatience. His quiet, taciturn wife was a little put out by Sylvia's non-appearance too, but she showed her anxiety by being shorter than usual in her replies to his perpetual wonders as to where the lass could have been tarrying, and by knitting away with extra diligence. "I've a vast o' mind to go down to Monkshaven mysel, and see after t' child. It's well on for 7. "No, Dannel," said his wife, "thou'd best not. Thy leg has been paining thee this week past, and thou'rt not up to such a walk. I'll rouse Kester and send him off, if thou thinks there's need on it." "I'll noan ha' Kester roused. Who's to go field betimes after t' sheep i' t' morn if he's ca'd up to neet? He'd missed t' lass and found a public house, I reckon," said Daniel querulously. "I'm not feared o' Kester," replied Bell. "He's a good un for knowing folk i' t' dark. But if thou'd rather, I'll put on my hood and cloak, and I'll just go at the end o' the lane, if thou'lt have an eye to th' milk, and see as it doesna boil over. She canna stomach it if it's bishop to her so little." Before Mrs. Robson, however, had put away her knitting, voices were heard at a good distance down the lane, but coming nearer every moment, and once more Daniel climbed the little brow to look and to listen. "It's a' reet," said he, hobbling quickly down. "Niver fidget thysel' wi' getting ready to go search for her. I'll tak thee bet it's Philip Hepburn's voice conveying her home, just as I said he would an hour sin'." Belle did not answer, as she might have done, that this probability of Philip's bringing Sylvia home had been her own suggestion, set aside by her husband as utterly unlikely. Another minute, and the countenances of both parents imperceptibly and unconsciously relaxed into pleasure as Sylvia came in. She looked very rosy from the walk and the October air, which began to be frosty in the evenings. There was a little cloud over her face at first, but it was quickly dispersed as she met the loving eyes of home. Philip, who followed her, had an excited but not altogether pleased look about him. He received a hearty greeting from Daniel, and a quiet one from his aunt. "Tak off thy pan o' milk, missus, and set on kettle. Milk may do for wenches, but Philip and me is for a drop o' good Hollands and watter this cold night. I'm a'most chilt at marrow wi' looking out for thee, lass, for t' mother was in a peck o' troubles about thy non coing home at daylight, and to keep hearkening out Browhead." This was entirely untrue, and Belle knew it to be so, but her husband did not. He had persuaded himself now, as he'd done often before, that what he had in reality done for his own pleasure or satisfaction, he had done in order to gratify some one else. "The town was rough with a riot between the press gang and the whaling folk, and I thought I'd best see Sylvia home." "Ay, ay, lad, always welcome, if it's only as an excuse for t' liquor. But whalers, say'st ta? Why, is it whalers in? There was none i' sight yesterday when I went down t' shore. It's early days for 'em as yet. This cursed old press gang's agate again doing its devil's work." His face changed as he ended his speech, and showed a steady passion of old hatred. "Ay, missus, you may look. I wunnot pick and choose my words, neither for you nor for nobody, when I speak o' that downed gang. I'm not ashamed of my words. They're true, and I'm ready to prove 'em. Where's my forefinger? Ay, and as good a top joint of a thumb as iver a man had. I wish I'd kept him in sperits, as they done things at Potticary's just to show t' lass what flesh and bone I made way with to get free. I ups wi' hatchet when I saw as I were fast aboard the man o' war standing out for sea. It were in time at war wi' America, and I could ne'er stomach the thought o' being murdered in my own language. So I ups wi' hatchet, and I says to Bill Watson, says I, 'Now, my lad, if thou'll do me a kindness I'll pay thee back, niver fear, and they'll be glad enough to get shut on us, and send us to old England again, just come down with a will. Now, missus, why can't you sit still and listen to me, instead of pottering after pans and what not?' said he, speaking crossly to his wife, who had heard the story scores of times, and, it must be confessed, was making some noise in preparing bread and milk for Sylvia's supper. Belle did not say a word in reply, but Sylvia tapped his shoulder with a pretty little authoritative air. "It's for me, Feyther. I'm just keen set for me supper. Once let me get quickly sit down to it, and Philip there to his glass of grog, and you'll never have such listeners in your life, and mother's mind will be at ease too." "Thou's a wilful wench," said the proud father, giving her a great slap on her back. "Well, set thee down to thy victual, and be quiet wi' thee, for I want to finish my tale to Philip. But perhaps I've telled it to you afore?" said he, turning round to question Hepburn. Hepburn could not say that he had not heard it, for he piqued himself on his truthfulness; but instead of frankly and directly owning this, he tried to frame a formal little speech, which would soothe Daniel's mortified vanity, and, of course, it had the directly opposite effect. Daniel resented being treated like a child, and yet turned his back on Philip with all the wilfulness of one. Sylvia did not care for her cousin, but hated the discomfort of having her father displeased, so she took up her tale of adventure, and told her father and mother of her afternoon's proceedings. Daniel pretended not to listen at first, and made ostentatious noises with his spoon and glass; but by and by he got quite warm and excited about the doings of the press gang, and scolded both Philip and Sylvia for not having learnt more particulars as to what was the termination of the riot. "I've been whaling mysel'," said he, "and I've heerd tales as whalers wear knives, and I 'd gi'en t' gang a taste o' my whittle if I'd been cotched up just as I'd set my foot ashore." "I don't know," said Philip. "We're at war wi' t' French, and we shouldn't like to be beaten; and yet if our numbers are not equal to theirs we stand a strong chance of it." "Not a bit on't, so be d—d!" said Daniel Robson, bringing down his fist with such violence on the round deal table that the glasses and earthenware shook again. "You'd not strike a child or a woman for sure, yet it'd be like it if we didn't give the Frenchies some 'vantages, if we took 'em wi' equal numbers. It's not fair play, and that's one place where t' shoe pinches. It's not fair play two ways. It's not fair play to cotch up men as had no call at fighting as another man's bidding, though they've no objection to fight a bit on their own account and were just landed, all keen after bread instead of biscuit, and flesh meat instead of junk, and beds instead of hammocks. I make nought o' sentiment's side, for I were ne'er given up to such carnal mindedness and posies. It's noane fair to cotch 'em up and put 'em in a stifling hole, all lined with metal for fear they shall whittle their way out, and send 'em off to sea for years and years to come. And again, it's no fair play to th' French. 4 of them is rightly matched wi' one o' us, and if we go and fight 'em 4 to 4, it's like as if you fell to beating Sylvie there, little Billy Croxton, as isn't breeched. And that's my mind. Missus, where's pipe?" Philip did not smoke, so took his turn at talking, a chance he seldom had with Daniel, unless the latter had his pipe between his lips. So after Daniel had filled it, and used Sylvia's little finger as a stopper to run down the tobacco, a habit of his to which she was so accustomed that she laid her hand on the table by him as naturally as she would have fetched him a spittoon when he began to smoke, Philip arranged his arguments, and began: "I'm for fair play with the French as much as any man, as long as we can be sure of beating them, but, I say, make sure of that, and then give 'em every advantage. Now I reckon Government is not sure as yet, for i' the papers it said as half the ships i' Channel han't got their proper complement o' men, and all I say is, let Government judge a bit for us, and if they say they're hampered for want o' men, why we must make it up somehow. John and Jeremiah Foster pay in taxes, and militiamen pays in person, and if sailors cannot pay in taxes, and will not pay in person, why they must be made to pay, and that's what press gang's for, I reckon. For my part, when I read of the way those French chaps are going on, I'm thankful to be governed by King George and a British constitution." Daniel took his pipe out of his mouth at this. "And when did I say a word against King George and the constitution? I only ax 'em to govern me as I judge best, and that's what I call representation. When I give my vote to Mr. Cholmley to go up to Parliament House, I as good as said, 'Now you go up there, sir, and tell 'em what I, Daniel Robson, think right, and what I, Daniel Robson, wish to have done. Else I'd be darned if I'd gi'e my vote to him or any other man. And if you think I want Seth Robson, as is my own brother's son and mate to a collier, to be cotched up by a press gang, and 10 to 1 his wages all unpaid, div you think I'd send up Mr. Cholmley to speak up for that piece of work? No, I." He took up his pipe again, shook out the ashes, puffed into it a spark, and shut his eyes, preparatory to listening. "But, asking pardon, laws is made for the good of the nation, not for your good or mine." Daniel could not stand this. He laid down his pipe, opened his eyes, stared straight at Philip before speaking, in order to enforce his words, and then said, slowly, "Nation here, nation there. I'm a man, and you're another, but nation's no way. If Measter Cholmley talked to me in that fashion, he'd look long for another vote fra me. I can make out King George, Mr. Pitt, and you and me, but nation go hang." Philip, who sometimes pursued an argument longer than was politic for himself, especially when he felt sure of being on the conquering side, did not see that Daniel Robson was passing out of the indifference of conscious wisdom into that state of anger which ensues when a question becomes personal in some unspoken way. Robson had contested this subject once or twice before, and had the remembrance of former disputes to add to his present vehemence. So it was well for the harmony of the evening that Bell and Sylvia returned from the kitchen to sit in the house place. They had been to wash up the pans and basins used for supper. Sylvia had privately shown off her cloak, and got over her mother's shake of the head at its colour with a coaxing kiss, at the end of which her mother had adjusted her cap with a "There, I've done with thee," but had no more heart to show her disapprobation, and now they came back to their usual occupations until it should please their visitor to go. Then they would rake the fire and be off to bed, for neither Sylvia's spinning nor Bell's knitting was worth candlelight, and morning hours are precious in a dairy. People speak of the way in which harp playing sets off a graceful figure. Spinning is almost as becoming an employment. A woman stands at the great wool wheel, one arm extended, the other holding the thread, her head thrown back to take in all the scope of her occupation. Or, if it is the lesser spinning wheel for flax, and it was this that Sylvia moved forwards to-night, the pretty sound of the buzzing, whirring motion, the attitude of the spinner, foot and hand alike engaged in the business, the bunch of gay-coloured ribbon that ties the bundle of flax on the rock, all make it into a picturesque piece of domestic business that may rival harp-playing any day for the amount of softness and grace which it calls out. Sylvia's cheeks were rather flushed by the warmth of the room after the frosty air. The blue ribbon with which she had thought it necessary to tie back her hair before putting on her hat to go to market had got rather loose, and allowed her disarranged curls to stray in a manner which would have annoyed her extremely if she had been upstairs to look at herself in the glass. But although they were not set in the exact fashion which Sylvia esteemed as correct, they looked very pretty and luxuriant. Her little foot, placed on the traddle, was still encased in its smartly buckled shoe, not slightly to her discomfort, as she was unaccustomed to be shod in walking far. Only as Philip had accompanied them home, neither she nor Molly had liked to go barefoot. Her round mottled arm and ruddy taper hand drew out the flax with nimble, agile motion, keeping time to the movement of the wheel. All this Philip could see. The greater part of her face was lost to him as she half averted it, with a shy dislike to the way in which she knew from past experience that cousin Philip always stared at her; and avert it as she would she heard with silent petulance the harsh creak of Philip's chair, as he heavily dragged it on the stone floor, sitting on it all the while, and felt that he was moving round so as to look at her as much as was in his power, without absolutely turning his back on either her father or mother. She got herself ready for the first opportunity of contradiction or opposition. "Well, wench, and hast ta bought this grand new cloak?" "Yes, feyther, it's a scarlet one." "Ay, ay, and what does mother say?" "Oh, mother's content," said Sylvia, a little doubting in her heart, but determined to defy Philip at all hazards. "Mother'll put up with it, if it doesna spot will be nearer fact, I'm thinking," said Bell, quietly. "I wanted Sylvia to take the grey," said Philip, "and I chose the red. It's so much gayer, and folk can see me the farther off. Feyther likes to see me at first turn at lane, don't you, feyther? And I'll never turn out when it's bound for to rain, for it shall never get a spot near it, mammy." "I reckoned it were to wear i' bad weather," said Bell. "Leastways that were the pretext for coaxing feyther out of it." She said it in a kindly tone, though the words became a prudent rather than a fond mother. But Sylvia understood her better than Daniel did, as it appeared. "Hold thy tongue, mother. She never spoke a pretext at all." He did not rightly know what a pretext was. Bell was a touch better educated than her husband, but he did not acknowledge this, and made a particular point of differing from her whenever she used a word beyond his comprehension. "She's a good lass at times, and if she liked to wear a yellow orange cloak she should have it. Here's Philip here, stands up for laws and press gangs. I'll set him to find us a law against pleasing our lass, and she our only one. Thou doesn't think on that, mother?" Bell did think of that often, oftener than her husband perhaps, for she remembered every day, and many times a day, the little one that had been born and had died while its father was away on some long voyage. But it was not her way to make replies. Sylvia, who had more insight into her mother's heart than Daniel, broke in with a new subject. "Oh, as for Philip, he's been preaching up laws all t' way home. I said nought but let Molly hold her own, or else I could ha' told a tale about silks and lace and things." Philip's face flushed. Not because of the smuggling, every one did that, only it was considered polite to ignore it. But he was annoyed to perceive how quickly his little cousin had discovered that his practice did not agree with his preaching, and vexed, too, to see how delighted she was to bring out the fact. He had some little idea, too, that his uncle might make use of his practice as an argument against the preaching he had lately been indulging in opposition to Daniel. But Daniel was too far gone in his Hollands and water to do more than enunciate his own opinions, which he did with hesitating and laboured distinctness in the following sentence: "What I think and say is this: laws is made for to keep some folks from harming others. Press gangs and coastguards harm me in my business, and keep me from getting what I want. Therefore, what I think and say is this: Mr. Cholmley should put down press gangs and coastguards. If that theere in't reason, I ask you to tell me what is. And if Mr. Cholmley don't do what I ask him, he may go whistle for my vote, he may." At this period in his conversation, Bell Robson interfered, not in the least from any feeling of disgust or annoyance, or dread of what he might say or do if he went on drinking, but simply as a matter of health. Sylvia, too, was in no way annoyed, not only with her father, but with every man whom she knew, excepting her cousin Philip. Was it a matter of course to drink till their ideas became confused? So she simply put her wheel aside, as preparatory to going to bed, when her mother said, in a more decided tone than that which she had used on any other occasion but this, and similar ones: "Come, mister, you've had as much as is good for you." "Let her be," said he, clutching at the bottle of spirits, but perhaps rather more good-humoured with what he had drunk than he was before. He jerked a little more into his glass before his wife carried it off, and locked it up in the cupboard, putting the key in her pocket, and then he said, winking at Philip: my man, niver gie a woman whip hand o'er you. You seen what brings a man to. But for all that I'll vote for Cholmley, and damp press gang." He had to shout out the last after Philip, for Hepburn, really anxious to please his aunt, and disliking drinking habits himself by constitution, was already at the door, and setting out on his return home, thinking, it must be confessed, far more of the character of Sylvia's shake of the hand than of the parting words of either his uncle or aunt. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 5. Story of the Press Gang. For a few days after the evening mentioned in the last chapter, the weather was dull. Not in quick, sudden showers did the rain come down, but in constant drizzle, blotting out all colour from the surrounding landscape, and filling the air with fine grey mist, until people breathed more water than air. At such times the consciousness of the nearness of the vast unseen sea acted as a dreary depression to the spirits. But besides acting on the nerves of the excitable, such weather affected the sensitive or ailing in material ways. Daniel Robson's fit of rheumatism incapacitated him from stirring abroad, and to a man of his active habits and somewhat inactive mind, this was a great hardship. He was not ill-tempered naturally, but this state of confinement made him more ill-tempered than he had ever been before in his life. He sat in the chimney-corner, abusing the weather, and doubting the wisdom or desirableness of all his wife saw fit to do in the usual daily household matters. The chimney-corner was really a corner at Haytersbank. There were 2 projecting walls on each side of the fireplace, running about 6 feet into the room, and a stout wooden settle was placed against one of these, while opposite was the circular-backed master's chair, the seat of which was composed of a square piece of wood, judiciously hollowed out, and placed with one corner to the front. Here, in full view of all the operations going on over the fire, sat Daniel Robson for 4 livelong days, advising and directing his wife in all such minor matters as the boiling of potatoes, the making of porridge, all the work on which she specially piqued herself, and on which she would have taken advice, no, not from the most skilled housewife in all the 3 Ridings. But somehow she managed to keep her tongue quiet from telling him, as she would have done any woman and any other man, to mind his own business, or she would pin a dishclout to his tail. She even checked Sylvia when the latter proposed, as much for fun as for anything else, that his ignorant directions should be followed, and the consequences brought before his eyes and his nose. Na, said Bell, the feyther's feyther, and we mun respect him. But it's dree work having a man in the house nursing the fire in such weather too, and not a soul coming near us, not even to fall out wi' him. For thee and me mustna do that, for the Bible's sake, dear, and a good stand-up wordy quarrel would do him a power o' good. Stir his blood like. I wish Philip would turn up. Bell sighed, for in these 4 days she had experienced somewhat of Madame de Maintenon's difficulty, and with fewer resources to meet it, of trying to amuse a man who was not amusable. For Bell, good and sensible as she was not a woman of resources. Sylvia's plan, undutiful as it was in her mother's eyes, would have done Daniel more good, even though it might have made him angry, than his wife's quiet, careful monotony of action, which, however it might conduce to her husband's comfort when he was absent, did not amuse him when present. Sylvia scouted the notion of cousin Philip coming into their household in the character of an amusing or entertaining person, till she nearly made her mother angry at her ridicule of the good steady young fellow, to whom Bell looked up as the pattern of all that early manhood should be. But the moment Sylvia saw she had been giving her mother pain, she left off her wilful little jokes, and kissed her, and told her she would manage all famously, and ran out of the back kitchen, in which mother and daughter had been scrubbing the churn and all the wooden implements of butter making. Bell looked at the pretty figure of her little daughter, as, running past with her apron thrown over her head, she darkened the window beneath which her mother was doing her work. She paused just for a moment, and then said, almost unawares to herself, "Bless thee, lass," before resuming her scouring of what already looked almost snow-white. Sylvia scampered across the rough farmyard in the wetting, drizzling rain to the place where she expected to find Kester, but he was not there, so she had to retrace her steps to the cow-house, and making her way up a rough kind of ladder staircase fixed straight against the wall, she surprised Kester, as he sat in the wool loft, looking over the fleeces reserved for the home spinning, by popping her bright face, swathed round with her blue woollen apron, up through the trap-door, and thus, her head the only visible part, she addressed the farm servant, who was almost like one of the family. "Kester, feyther's just tiring hisself wi' weariness and vexation, sitting by the fireside with his hands afore him, and nought to do." and mother and me can't think on aught as'll rouse him up to a bit of a laugh, or aught more cheerful than a scolding. Now, Kester, thou mun just be off and find Harry Duncan, the tailor, and bring him here. It's getting on for Martinmas, and he'll be coming his rounds, and he may as well come here first as last, and feyther's clothes want a deal o' mending up, and Harry's always full of his news, and anyhow, he'll do for feyther to scold, and be a new person too, and that's somewhat for all on us. Now go like a good old Kester as you are." Kester looked at her with loving, faithful admiration. He had set himself his day's work in his master's absence, and was very desirous of finishing it, but somehow he never dreamed of resisting Sylvia, so he only stated the case. "Tools a vast o' muck in it, and a thowt as I'd fettle it, and do it up, but I reckon I mun do your bidding." "There's a good old Kester," said she, smiling, and nodding her muffled head at him. Then she dipped down out of his sight, then rose up again. He had never taken his slow, moony eyes from the spot where she had disappeared, to say, "Now, Kester, be wary and deep. Thou mun tell Harry Duncan not to let on as we've sent for him, but just to come in as if he were on his round, and took us first, and he mun ask feyther if there's any work for him to do, and I'll answer for it, he'll have a welcome and a half. Now be deep and fause, mind thee." "Ah's deep and fause enow wi' simple folk, but what can I do wi' Duncan be as fause as me, as happen he may be?" "Go away wi' thee. If Duncan be Solomon, thou mun be the Queen of Sheba, and I's bound for to say she outwitted him at last." Kester laughed so long at the idea of his being the Queen of Sheba, that Sylvia was back by her mother's side before the cachinnation ended. That night, just as Sylvia was preparing to go to bed in her little closet of a room, she heard some shot rattling at her window. She opened the little casement, and saw Kester standing below. He recommenced where he left off, with a laugh. "Heh, heh, heh, I's been t' queen. I's taken Duncan on t' reet side, and he'll come in to-morrow, just permiscus, and ax for work, like as if 'twere a favour. T'oud felly were a bit cross-grained at startin', for he were working at Farmer Krusky's up t'other side o' town, where they puts a strike and a half a mouth into beer, when most folk put nobbut a strike. And 't made him ill to convince, but he'll come, niver fear." The honest fellow never said a word of the shilling he had paid out of his own pocket to forward Sylvia's wishes, and to persuade the tailor to leave the good beer. All his anxiety now was to know if he had been missed, and if it was likely that a scolding awaited him in the morning. "T'oud master didn't set up his back, 'cause I didn't come in to supper." "He questioned a bit as to what thou were about, but mother didn't know, and I held my peace. Mother carried thy supper into loft for thee. I'll gang after 't then, for I'm like a pair o' bellows wi'out t' wind, just two flat sides wi' nowt betwixt." The next morning Sylvia's face was a little redder than usual when Harry Donkin's bow legs were seen circling down the path to the house door. "Here's Donkin for sure!" exclaimed Bell, when she caught sight of him a minute after her daughter. "Well, I just call that lucky, for he'll be company for thee while Sylvia and me has to turn the cheeses." This was too original a remark for a wife to make, in Daniel's opinion, on this especial morning when his rheumatism was twinging him more than usual, so he replied with severity, "That's all t' women know about it. Wi' them it's company, 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 and they think a man's no better than theirselves. I'd have you to know, I've a vast o' thoughts in myself, as I'm no unwilling to lay out for t' benefit of every man. I've niver gotten time for meditation sin' I were married, leastways sin' I left to sea. Aboard ship, wi' never a woman within leagues o' hail, and upon t' masthead in special, I could." "Then I'd better tell Donkin as we've no work for him," said Sylvia, instinctively managing her father by agreeing with him, instead of reasoning with or contradicting him. "Now, there you go!" wrenching himself round, for fear Sylvia should carry her meekly made threat into execution. "Ugh, ugh!" as his limb hurt him. "Come in, Harry, come in, and talk a bit o' sense to me, for I've been shut up wi' women these 4 days, and am a'most natteral by this time. I's bound for it they'll find you some work, if 'tis naught but to save their own fingers." So Harry took off his coat, and seated himself, professional wise, on the hastily cleared dresser, so that he might have all the light afforded by the long low casement window. Then he blew in his thimble, sucked his finger, so that they might adhere tightly together, and looked about for a subject for opening conversation, while Sylvia and her mother might be heard opening and shutting drawers and box lids before they could find the articles that needed repair or that were required to mend each other. "Women's well enough i' their way," said Daniel in a philosophizing tone, "but a man may have too much on 'em. Now there's me, leg fast these 4 days, and I'll make free to say to you, I'd rather a deal ha' been loading dung into wettest weather, and I reckon it's the being wi' nought but women as tires me so. They talk so foolish it gets into bones like. Now thou know'st thou'rt not called much of a man other, but bless you, t' 9th part's summat to be thankful for after nought but women. And yet, you seen, they were for sending you away in their foolishness. Well, missus, and who's to pay for t' fettling of all them clothes?" As Bell came down with her arms full. She was going to answer her husband meekly and literally according to her wont, but Sylvia, already detecting the increased cheerfulness of his tone, called out from behind her mother, "I am, feyther. I'm going for to sell my new cloak as I bought Thursday, for thy mending on your old coats and waistcoats." "Hearken till her," said Daniel, chuckling. "She's a true wench. 3 days sin', none so full as she at a new cloak that she's now faint to sell." "Ay, Harry, if feyther won't pay you for making all those clothes as good as new, I'll sell my new red cloak sooner than you shall go unpaid." "I reckon it's a bargain," said Harry, casting sharp professional eyes on the heap before him, and singling out the best article as to texture for examination and comment. "They're all again these metal buttons," said he. "Silk weavers has been petitioning ministers to make a law to favour silk buttons, and I did hear tell as there were informers going about spying after metal buttons, and as how they could haul you before a justice for wearing on 'em. I were wedding 'em, and I'll wear 'em to my dying day, or I'll wear none at all. They're for making such a pack o' laws, they'll be for meddling wi' my fashion o' sleeping next, and taxing me for every snore I give. They've been after t' winders, and after t' vittle, and after t' very sout in it. It's dearer by half and more nor it were when I were a boy. They're a mettlesome set o' folks, lawmakers is, and I'll never believe King George as ought to do it. But mark my words, I will wed wi' brass buttons, and brass buttons I'll wear to my death, and if they moither me about it, I'll wear brass buttons in me coffin." By this time Harry had arranged a certain course of action with Mrs. Robson, conducting the consultation and agreement by signs. His thread was flying fast already, and the mother and daughter felt more free to pursue their own business than they had done for several days. For it was a good sign that Daniel had taken his pipe out of the square hollow in the fireside wall, where he usually kept it, and was preparing to diversify his remarks with satisfying interludes of puffing. "Why, look ye, this very baccy had a run for it. It came ashore sewed up neatly enough i' a woman's stays, as was wife to a fishing smack down at t' bay yonder. She were a lean thing as ever you saw, when she went for to see her husband aboard the vessel, but she come back lustier by a deal, and wi' many a thing on her, here and there, beside baccy, and that were in t' face o' t' coastguard, and yon tender and all, but she made as though she were tipsy, and so they did not but curse her and get out on her way. "Speaking of tender, there's been a piece o' work in Monkshaven this week wi' t' press gang," said Harry. Ay, our lass was telling about it, but Lord bless ye, there's no getting to rights on a story out on a woman, though I will say this for our Sylvie, she's as bright a lass as ever a man looked at." Now the truth was that Daniel had not liked to demean himself, at the time when Sylvia came back so full of what she had seen at Monkshaven, by evincing any curiosity on the subject. He had then thought that the next day he would find some business that should take him down to the town, when he could learn all that was to be learnt, without flattering his womenkind by asking questions, as if anything they might say could interest him. He had a strong notion of being a kind of domestic Jupiter. "It's made a deal o' work in Monkshaven. Folk had gotten to think nought o' the tender, she lay so still, and the lieutenant paid such a good price for all he wanted for the ship. But a Thursday, t' Resolution, first whaler back this season, came in port, and t' press gang showed their teeth, and carried off 4 as good able-bodied seamen as iver I made trousers for, and t' place were all up like a nest o' wasps when you've set your foot in t' midst. They were so mad, they were ready for to fight the very paving stones. I wish I had been there, I just wish I had. I've a score for to reckon up wi' t' press gang." And the old man lifted up his right hand, his hand on which the forefinger and thumb were maimed and useless, partly in denunciation, and partly as a witness of what he had endured to escape from the service, abhorred because it was forced. His face became a totally different countenance, with the expression of settled and unrelenting indignation, which his words called out. "Go on, man, go on," said Daniel, impatient with Donkin for the little delay occasioned by the necessity of arranging his work more fully. "Ay, all in good time, for I've a long tale to tell yet, and I mun have someone to iron me out my seams, and look me out my bits, for there's none here fit for my purpose." "Dang thy bits! Here, Sylvie, come and be tailor's man, and let the chap get settled sharp, for I'm fain to hear his story." Sylvia took her directions, and placed her irons in the fire, and ran upstairs for the bundle which had been put aside by her careful mother for occasions like the present. It consisted of small pieces of various coloured cloth, cut out of old coats and waistcoats, and similar garments, when the whole had become too much worn for use, yet when part had been good enough to be treasured by a thrifty housewife. Daniel grew angry before Donkin had selected his patterns and settled the work to his own mind. "Well," said he at last, "I mout be a young man a-going a-wooing, by t' pains thou'st taken for to match my old clothes. I don't care if they're patched with scarlet, I tell thee, so as thou'lt work away at thy tale with thy tongue, same time as thou works at thy needle with thy fingers." Then, as I were saying, all Monkshaven were like a nest o' wasps, flying hither and thither, and making sich a buzzing and a talking as niver were, and each wi' his sting out, ready for to vent his venom o' rage and revenge. And women crying and sobbing in t' streets, when, Lord help us, o' Saturday came a worse time than iver, for all Friday there had been a kind o' expectation and dismay about t' good fortune as t' mariners had said was off St Abb's Head o' Thursday, when t' Resolution came in, and there was wives and maids wi' husbands and sweethearts aboard t' good fortune, ready to throw their eyes out on their heads wi' gazing nor'ards or to sea, as were all one haze o' blankness wi' t' rain, and when th' afternoon tide comed in, and niver a line on her to be seen, folk were uncertain as to whether she were holding off for fear o' the tinder, as were out o' sight too, or what were her make o' going on. And t' poor wet draggled women folk came up to town, some slowly crying as if their hearts was sick, and others just bent their heads to the wind and went straight to their homes, noather looking nor speaking to any one, but barred their doors and stiffened theirselves up for a night o' waiting. Saturday morn, you'll mind Saturday morn, it were stormy and gusty, downreet dirty weather. There stood t' folk again by daylight, a watching and a straining, and by that tide the good fortune come o'er the bar. But excisemen had sent back her news by t' boat as took 'em there. They'd a deal of oil and a vast o' blubber, but for all that her flag was drooping in the rain, half mast high, for mourning and sorrow, and they'd a dead man aboard, a dead man as was living and strong last sunrise, and there was another as lay between life and death, and there was 7 more as should ha' been there as weren't, but was carried off by the gang. The frigate, as we'na heard tell on, as lying off Hartlepool, got tidings for t' tender as captured a seaman o' Thursday, and the Aurora, as they called her, made off for t' nor'ward, and 9 leagues off St Abb's Head, the Resolution thinks she were. She seed t' frigate, and knowed by her build she were a man o' war, and guessed she were bound on king's kidnapping. I seen the wounded man mysel' wi' my own eyes, and he'll live, niver a man died yet with such a strong purpose of vengeance in him. He could barely speak, for he were badly shot, but his colour come and went, as t' master's mate and the captain telled me and some others how the Aurora fired at him, and how the innocent whaler hoisted her colours. But afore they were fairly run up, another shot come close in the shrouds, and then the Greenland ship being to windward, bore down on the frigate. But as they knew she were an old fox and bent on mischief, Kinraid, that's he who lies a dying, only he'll noane die, as bound, the specksioneer bade the men go down between decks, and fasten the hatches well, and he'd stand guard, he and captain, and owd master's mate, being left up to deck for to give a welcome, just skin deep, to the boat's crew from the Aurora, as they could see coming towards 'em o'er the water, with their regular man-o'-war's rowing. "Damn 'em!" said Daniel in soliloquy, and under his breath. Sylvia stood, poising her iron, and listening eagerly, afraid to give Donkin the hot iron for fear of interrupting the narrative. unwilling to put it into the fire again, because that action would perchance remind him of his work, which now the tailor had forgotten, so eager was he in telling his story. Well, they come on over to water with great bounds, and up the sides they come like locusts, all armed men, and the captain says he saw Kinraid hide away his whaling knife under some tarpaulin, and he knew he meant mischief, and he would no more ha' stopped him wi' a word nor he would ha' stopped him from killing a whale. And when the Aurora's men were aboard, one on 'em runs to the helm, and at that the captain says he felt as if his wife were kissed afore his face, but says he, I bethought me on the men as were shut up below hatches, and I remembered the folk at Monkshaven as were looking out for us even then, and I said to mysel' I would speak fair as long as I could, more by token of the whaling knife as I could see glinting bright under the black tarpaulin. So he spoke quite fair and civil, though he'd seed they was nearing the Aurora, and the Aurora was nearing them. Then t' navy captain hailed him through the trumpet wi' a great rough blast, and says he, Order your men to come out on deck. And the captain of the whaler says his men cried up from under the hatches as they'd never be given up without bloodshed, and he sees Kinraid take out his pistol and look well to the priming, so he says to the navy captain, We are protected Greenland men, and you've no right to meddle with us. But the navy captain only bellows the more, Order your men to come on deck. If they won't obey you, and you have lost the command of your vessel, I reckon you're in a state of mutiny, and you may come aboard to Aurora and such men as are willing to follow you, and I'll fire into the rest. You see, that were the depth of the man. He were for pretending and pretexting as the captain couldna manage his own ship, and as he'd help him. But our Greenland captain were none so poor-spirited, and says he, She's full of oil, and I wear you a consequences if you fire into her. And anyhow, pirate or no pirate, for the word pirate stuck in his gizzard, I'm an honest Monkshaven man, and I come fra a land where there's great icebergs and many a deadly danger, but niver a press gang, thank God. And that's what you are, I reckon. Them's the words he told me, but whether he spoke 'em out bold at the time I's not so sure. They were in his mind for to speak, only maybe prudence got the better on him, for he said he prayed in his heart to bring his cargo safe to the owners, come what might. Well, Aurora's men aboard the Good Fortune cried out, Might they fire down the hatches and bring the men out that away? And then the specksioneer, he speaks, and he says he stands o'er the hatches, and he has 2 good pistols and summat besides, and he don't care for his life, being a bachelor. But all below are married men, you see, and he'll put an end to the first 2 chaps as come near the hatches. And they say he picked off 2 as made for to come near, and then, just as he were stooping for the whaling knife, and it's as big as a sickle. Teach folks as don't know a whaling knife, cried Daniel. I were a Greenland man mysel'. They shot him through the side, and dizzied him, and kicked him aside for dead, and fired down the hatches, and killed 1 man and disabled 2, and then the rest cried for quarter, for life is sweet e'en aboard a king's ship. And the Aurora carried him off, wounded men, and able men and all, leaving Kinraid for dead, as wasn't dead, and Darley for dead, as was dead, and the captain and master's mate, as were too old for work. And the captain, as loves Kinraid like a brother, poured rum down his throat and bandaged him up, and has sent for the first doctor in Monkshaven for to get the slugs out. For they say there's never such a harpooner in the Greenland seas, and I can speak from my own, seeing he's a fine young fellow where he lies there, all stark and wan for weakness and loss of blood. But Darley's dead as a doornail, and there'll be such a burying of him as never was seen afore in Monkshaven come Sunday. And now give us t' iron, wench, and let's lose no more time a talking. It's noan loss o' time, said Daniel, moving himself heavily in his chair to feel how helpless he was once more. If I were as young as once I were, nay, lad, if I had nae these sore rheumatics now, I reckon as t' press gang 'ud find out as t' shouldn't do such things for nothing. Bless thee, man, it's wore nor in my youth into Ameriky war, and then 'twere bad enough. And Kinraid? asked Sylvia, drawing a long breath. After the effort of realizing it all, her cheeks had flushed up, and her eyes had glittered during the progress of the tale. Oh, he'll do. He'll not die. Life's stuff is in him yet. He'll be Molly Corney's cousin, I reckon, said Sylvia, bethinking her with a blush of Molly Corney's implication that he was more than a cousin to her, and immediately longing to go off and see Molly, and hear all the little details which women do not think it beneath them to give to women. From that time Sylvia's little heart was bent on this purpose, but it was not one to be openly avowed even to herself. She only wanted sadly to see Molly, and she almost believed herself that it was to consult her about the fashion of her cloak, which Donkin was to cut out, and which she was to make under his directions. At any rate, this was the reason she gave to her mother, when the day's work was done, and a fine gleam came out upon the pale and watery sky towards evening. End of chapter 5.